My name is Audrey Callahan. I'm 34 years old, and the night my parents decided to erase me from my own family's future, they did it between the turkey and the pie. My father stood at the head of the Thanksgiving table with a crystal glass in one hand and the kind of smile men wear when they think the whole room belongs to them. He announced that the company my grandfather built had finally been sold, that the deal was worth $50 million, that our family was entering a new chapter, and that some people at the table had earned the right to celebrate more than others. My brother laughed before he even finished the sentence. My sister looked like she was already mentally spending money that had not cleared a bank account yet. My mother kept staring at her plate like silence could still protect her from what was coming. Then my father looked right at me and said that since I had walked away from the family business years ago, I would not be receiving a single cent. He said people who abandon the family should not expect to profit from its legacy. I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, and not because I was surprised, but because for the first time all night, he had made this easy. I let the table settle into that ugly little silence families create when cruelty has been disguised as honesty, and then I asked the one question that made him lift his chin even higher. "Dad?" I said softly. "Who's the buyer?" Before I tell you what happened when he answered that question, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me honestly, if your own family cut you out at Thanksgiving in front of everyone, would you leave quietly, or would you make sure they remembered your name for the rest of their lives? He answered with pride, with that deep, satisfied pride only a man like my father could have when he believed he was delivering a final public humiliation. "Everest Holdings," he said, "50 million. My brother lifted his glass again. My sister smirked. My mother whispered, "Please, not tonight." But she said it the way she had said everything my whole life, softly enough to comfort herself and too softly to stop anyone. I laughed. Not loud, not messy, not emotional. Just enough to make every fork go still. Then I looked at my father and said, "Dad, I am Everest Holdings." For 1 second the whole room forgot how to breathe. My brother's smile vanished first. My sister's fork slipped out of her hand and cracked against the china. My mother's face drained so quickly it looked like someone had blown the color out of her. My father blinked once, then twice, like he thought the sentence had landed wrong in his ear. "What did you just say?" he asked, but the edge in his voice was already gone. I reached into my bag, took out a clean black card, and set it beside his plate. "Everest Holdings, Audrey Callahan, Managing Principal." Then I laid down a summary packet with the Monday closing schedule, the council contact page, and the transaction cover sheet bearing the buyer entity he had been bragging about for weeks, without ever bothering to learn whose money was behind it. My brother pushed his chair back and said I was bluffing. Right then, my phone rang. I looked at the screen, smiled, and hit speaker. "Audrey," said Owen Pierce, the acquisitions lead who had handled the deal under my direction. "Just confirming legal sent the final schedules and Monday's 9 a.m. closing is locked unless seller defaults tonight." Nobody at the table moved. I watched the words sink into my father's face one by one. He had not sold the company to a faceless private group. He had sold it to the daughter he spent years training everyone else to underestimate. "You're lying," my brother snapped, but there was no conviction in it now. My sister looked from me to the papers to my father, waiting for him to put reality back together for her. My mother shut her eyes as if she had always feared some version of this moment, and was finally seeing the bill come due. My father straightened in his chair and tried to summon the old voice, the one that had ruled our family and company for decades, the one that had turned other people's doubt into obedience. "I'd kill this deal before I handed you that company," he said. I held his gaze and answered, "Then maybe you should have read the debt covenants before humiliating the buyer." My brother actually laughed at that. A short, hard sound like he was trying to deny fear through contempt, but it died as soon as he saw our father's expression. That was the first time in my life I ever saw Thomas Callahan look genuinely afraid of me. The reveal would have been enough for some people. It would have been enough for a daughter who only wanted revenge hot and immediate, the kind that explodes and disappears. But what I wanted had never been noise. What I wanted was precision. They thought Thanksgiving had been the night they cut me out. They had no idea it was only the night they discovered I had already built the knife, sharpened it in silence, and placed it in their own hands months before. Callahan Hearth and Timber had never been just another family business. In Western North Carolina, our name carried the kind of regional respect people attach to craftsmanship when it has survived long enough to feel like folklore. My grandfather started the company with one workshop outside Asheville, building custom hardwood tables and architectural millwork for mountain inns, then grew it into a high-end manufacturer supplying boutique lodges, private clubs, restoration projects, and luxury hospitality spaces across the Southeast. By the time I was old enough to know the difference between cherry, walnut, and white oak by smell alone, I already loved the place more than I loved my own house. My grandfather would walk me through the floor before school and explain why certain grains behave differently, why cheap shortcuts always show in the final finish, why good work was not just about beauty, but about discipline people could trust. By 14, I understood production schedules better than most adults who worked there. By 17, I could look at a bid sheet and tell you where we were, underpricing labor. By 22, I had built digital render presentations and margin models that helped us win a boutique hotel account my father had assumed would go to a larger manufacturer. In our family, none of that ever translated into status. My younger brother had what my father called presence, which usually meant broad shoulders, loud opinions, and the privilege of being wrong without consequences. My sister had polish, which meant she photographed well in the showroom, charmed clients at dinners, and knew how to repeat half-understood talking points with just enough confidence to sound important. I had the thing our company actually needed if it was going to survive the next decade: systems, modern design workflow, contract discipline, vendor structure, and the ability to see where the business should be going before the market dragged it there. That was precisely why I was dangerous inside my father's version of family life. Men like Thomas Callahan can tolerate a daughter being bright. What they cannot tolerate is a daughter being indispensable in a way that exposes how replaceable they have allowed a son to become. The first time I understood how deep that truth ran, I was 25 and had spent 6 weeks building a proposal to move part of our business away from one-off vanity residential projects and deeper into boutique hospitality packages, where our craftsmanship and margins could both grow. I had the numbers, the market data, the design positioning, and a rollout plan for digital visualization that would let clients approve concepts faster and reduce production revisions. My father listened through the entire presentation in a conference room full of older men who still treated computers like decorative interruptions, then leaned back in his chair and said, "That all sounds very corporate, Audrey. This business is built on instinct." 2 months later, he presented a watered-down version of my strategy to the board as Blake's fresh thinking and praised him for understanding where the company needed to go. I still remember the heat in my face and the way my brother smiled without even pretending to be embarrassed. But the moment that broke something permanent in me came after my grandfather died. There was a meeting at my parents' house with the estate attorney, the internal accountant, and our senior operations manager. I already knew my grandfather had believed in me because he told me so more than once when nobody else was around. He never promised me the company outright, and I would never lie about that. But he did say, quietly, "If this place is going to be standing in 20 years, they're going to need your mind." I held on to that sentence through college, through long work days, through every family dinner where my ideas were tolerated only until one of the men in the room wanted credit for them. At that meeting, after the coffee was poured and the lawyer had gone through enough paperwork to make grief sound administrative, my father announced that future succession planning would be centered on Blake. My sister would oversee brand development and client experience. I, according to him, would always have a place if I wanted to contribute in a supportive strategic capacity. A supportive strategic capacity. That was his phrase for the daughter whose work he kept stealing. I asked him whether he had any intention of recognizing the systems and growth models I had built for the company over the last 3 years. He smiled the way cruel people do when they believe they are being reasonable. "You're talented, Audrey," he said, "but this company needs continuity, and continuity matters to clients. They want to look across the table and see the future." What he meant was, they wanted to see a son. What he meant was no matter how much of the engine I built, he would still hand the keys to someone who could barely drive because that person fit the family portrait in his head. I left Asheville within 3 months. I moved to Austin, slept on a friend's couch for 6 weeks, took freelance commercial interior drafting jobs, then contract project work, then eventually built what became Juniper Rose Studio, a design and procurement company for boutique hotels, restaurants, and mountain hospitality spaces. I worked like a woman who had been publicly erased and had decided to turn absence into leverage. I did not become successful overnight, and that matters because I never wanted a story where I just got lucky. I built client by client, project by project, learning where hospitality buyers were desperate for reliable custom fixture partners who understood aesthetics and execution at the same time. Juniper Row grew because I could do what my father never understood. I could marry beauty to systems. 3 years later, I landed a multi-property lodge group that turned my company from respectable to valuable. 4 years after that, I sold a majority stake to a national design supply platform in a deal that gave me more capital than anyone back home would have believed I could touch. I did not buy a bigger house. I did not go public with my money. I built a holding company. I called it Everest Holdings because by then I had learned something useful. The people who dismiss you most care deeply about names when they think names imply power. I started investing in undervalued American manufacturing and design businesses that had strong bones and weak leadership. Then, through industry channels, I heard my father was quietly shopping Callahan Hearth and Timber. Margins were falling. Maintenance had been deferred. Cash flow was tighter than the company's public confidence suggested. Worse, one of the bidders circling it had a reputation for asset stripping, vendor squeezing, and gutting legacy staff after close. I looked at the file my analyst put in front of me and realized 2 truths at the same time. My father was about to sell my grandfather's legacy from a position of weakness, and if I let someone else take it, the place that taught me what good work meant would become a line item in someone else's collapse plan. That was the day I called my attorney, Rebecca Sloan, and said, "I don't want revenge that screams. I want revenge that signed." Rebecca had been at Stanford Law, top of her class, then New York, then Dallas, then independent by choice because she liked clients who could actually think. She was the first person I ever told the emotional truth of the transaction to. And even then, I told it like a business problem because that was easier than saying out loud that I was still shaped by rooms where I had been treated like extra furniture. She listened without interrupting, then asked the only question that mattered. "If you buy this company," she said, "are you buying it to save it? Or are you buying it to hurt them?" I told her the real answer, not the flattering one. Both, but the company comes first. That was enough for her. We structured the acquisition the right way. Banker intermediary, outside counsel, layered financing, separate special purpose entities, and no mention of my name anywhere my father could see it in the early stage. Owen Pierce handled seller communications. He was smart, polished, impossible to rattle, and exactly the kind of man Thomas would respect without suspecting he was being guided by the daughter he dismissed. The non-disclosure agreement went out. Financials came in. Then due diligence started. And that was when my anger stopped being abstract. My father had not merely failed to modernize the business. He had wrapped decline in the language of tradition and expected everyone else to mistake his ego for stewardship. There were personal expenses running through the company that had been hidden in vague executive categories. There were client entertainment charges tied to Blake that looked more like a young man practicing entitlement than a leader cultivating accounts. There was a 6-figure compensation structure and travel budget supporting Paige's brand leadership, despite the fact that external consultants had been doing most of the strategy work. Machinery replacement had been delayed to make margins look cleaner. There were warranty issues tied to a hotel package in Tennessee that had been minimized in seller summaries. Vendor payment timing was being stretched just enough to preserve appearance without solving underlying discipline. My father had even started negotiating from the headline valuation, as if he had already converted it into family cash. Men like him love gross numbers because gross numbers let them celebrate before the details strip them naked. We built the deal around that weakness. Rebecca kept the top-line purchase price exactly where seller pride wanted it, high enough to make Thomas boast at dinner and dream in public. Underneath it, we wrote the truth. Debt adjustment, deferred maintenance reserve, escrow retention, representation and warranty holdbacks, post-closing reimbursement review. Management transition authority effective immediately. Key person access suspension. Compensation verification. Vendor reconciliation. Potential clawback triggers if material omissions were confirmed. My father would see 50 million and stop reading. I knew that because he had been ignoring the fine print of other people's talent his whole life. The more the deal progressed, the more personal it became. Not because I changed the structure to punish them, but because the documents kept revealing exactly who they had chosen to be when nobody forced them. I found a note tied to Blake's comp review praising him for projecting continuity clients can trust. I found internal budget commentary describing Page as important to maintaining image. I found margin commentary dismissing process improvements as unnecessary complexity, when those exact improvements could have saved thousands in change orders and scrap. Every page reminded me that in my father's universe, image always outranked substance until the bill came due. Rebecca called one evening after reviewing a revised disclosure set and said, "Your father thinks he's selling from strength. He's actually signing from fear and dressing it as pride." I stared at the city lights outside my office and felt something colder than anger settle into place. "Good," I said. "Let him keep the pride. I'll take the signatures." There was still the question of whether buying the company would make me more like him than I wanted to admit. I would be lying if I said I never asked it. There were nights I sat alone in my kitchen and wondered whether revenge that elegant was still revenge, whether a daughter who carefully engineered the legal collapse of her family's illusions had crossed some private moral line. But every time I drifted toward guilt, I remembered two things. First, I was not inventing liabilities. I was pricing reality. Second, if I walked away, my grandfather's company would likely be gutted by strangers while the people who ran it into the ground escaped with a cleaner story than they deserved. I decided I could live with being called ruthless by people who had spent years calling my competence inconvenient. Then, Thanksgiving approached, and Owen told me what I had half expected all along. Thomas planned to announce the deal over dinner. Public stage, family audience, one more chance to declare himself king before he signed away the castle. Rebecca laughed when I told her. "He's actually writing your reveal for you," she said. "All you have to do is show up." So I did. I drove into Asheville the day before, checked into a hotel instead of staying at my parents' house, reviewed the latest schedules one last time, and looked through the old executive summary photos of the workshop that had started everything. My grandfather used to say that wood tells you who it is under pressure. Maybe families do too. When I walked into Thanksgiving dinner, I was not there as a daughter hoping to be seen. I was there as the buyer, the future controlling party, and the only person in that room who actually understood the cost of what they had done. That was why I did not need to yell when I said, "Dad, I am Everest Holdings." A woman only needs volume when she still doubts the ground beneath her. I had already bought the ground. Monday morning looked exactly like the kind of scene my father had imagined ending very differently for himself. The conference room at Callahan Hearth and Timber had been polished for importance. Dark walnut table, catered breakfast no one was touching. Legal pads lined up like props in a play about power. My father arrived in a charcoal suit he saved for bank meetings and funerals. My brother came in carrying himself with that loose confidence of a man who had never once mistaken inherited access for borrowed status. My sister wore cream cashmere and the face of someone still choosing tile finishes for a house she had already decided the sale would buy. My mother sat quietly at the far end, hands folded, not touching coffee, eyes down. I entered with Rebecca, Owen, our finance lead, Everest's operations advisor, and two outside specialists. The moment my father saw the room fill around me instead of around him, the energy shifted. He was still trying to decide whether he could reclaim authority through performance. Rebecca made sure he never found out. Formalities were brief. Owen congratulated everyone on reaching the closing stage, summarized the transaction sequence, then handed the floor to Rebecca for the purchase price mechanics. She started exactly where my father wanted her to start. As reflected in the purchase agreement, she said, "The enterprise value for the transaction is $50 million. My father exhaled very slightly. Blake leaned back in his chair. Paige almost smiled. Then Rebecca kept talking. She walked them through net debt. She walked them through machinery replacement reserves tied to deferred capital expenditures at the primary production site. She walked them through pending warranty exposure on hospitality installs that had not been fully disclosed in earlier summaries. She walked them through escrow retention, indemnity holdbacks, and reimbursement review tied to unauthorized executive and quasi-executive spending. With every sentence, the real number shrank. Not on paper, not technically, but in the only place that mattered to people like my family, in their fantasies. Blake interrupted first, saying the expense treatment was unfair. Rebecca slid a packet toward him and said, "These are the charges under your authority code, Mr. Callahan. Hunting lodge weekends, vehicle lease allocation discrepancies, entertainment reporting without client traceability, and unsupported discretionary reimbursements." He stared at the pages like words could rearrange themselves if he glared hard enough. Paige tried next, insisting her compensation and budget authority had been approved. Owen answered in the same calm tone he used for banker calls. "Approved is not the same as justified." My father stepped in after that, declaring the adjustments excessive, the reserves punitive, the holdbacks insulting. Rebecca did not even blink. "They are standard responses to verified risk," she said. "The issue is not whether the schedules are harsh. The issue is whether the disclosures were complete." Then she turned the page and explained the difference between enterprise value and seller cash proceeds, a difference my father should have understood before he began using the headline number as family theater. Debt came off. Escrow remained restricted. Exposure stayed live. Certain funds would not move freely until post-closing review confirmed representations were accurate. The room kept getting quieter because with each clarification, another private fantasy died. Paige's face changed first, and I knew exactly what thought had hit her. The house deposit. She had probably already made promises she could not keep. Blake's came next. The slow collapse of a man realizing the title he had been wearing like armor had never been his to defend. But the moment that mattered most was my father's. Thomas Callahan had spent his entire adult life confusing command with competence. In that room, he discovered the market distinguishes between them. "This is not what I agreed to," he said, voice thick with rising panic. Rebecca opened the signed packet to the relevant page and rotated it toward him. "This is exactly what you agreed to," she said. "You just did not expect the schedules to matter." I almost admired the sentence for how perfectly it cut. Blake stood up and accused me of engineering a trap. "No," I said, still seated. "I priced what you all chose to do." He looked at me with pure hate then, but hate is often just humiliation searching for a target. Paige started crying, the kind of crying that is half shame and half outrage, that shame has arrived at all. My mother closed her eyes. My father planted both hands on the table and said, "I built this company." I leaned forward and answered with the calm I had paid for over years of discipline. "Grandpa built it, you inherited it. Then you spent years acting like inheritance and leadership were the same thing." He turned red, then gray, then old. Truly old, in a way I had never seen. Like the room itself had stripped off the story he told about himself every day. There are moments in revenge stories where the audience wants screaming. This was not one of them. This was better. This was a man being forced to understand that contracts do not care how loudly he once ruled his dining room. He threatened to walk. Owen reminded him of lender posture, existing covenant pressure, and the likely consequences of defaulting at this stage after the diligence path he had already opened. The truth was brutal and simple. If he refused to close, the company could spiral faster than his pride could save it. He looked at the window, at the papers, at my mother, at me. Then he signed. My brother signed where required. My mother signed what she had to. My sister signed the acknowledgments tied to compensation review. With each signature, another branch of the family myth broke off and fell. Once execution was complete, Owen announced post-closing governance transition. Effective immediately, Everest Holdings assumed strategic control. Executive access would be modified pending compliance review. Blake's operational authority was suspended. Page's budget and systems access would be disabled pending reimbursement verification. Thomas was removed from executive decision-making effective at noon. That landed harder than everything else combined. My father had imagined retirement as applause. Instead, he got escorted out of power by the daughter he tried to shame over turkey and candles. Blake muttered that this wasn't over. Paige asked what she was supposed to tell people. My mother still had not lifted her eyes. I watched my father sign the final document with a hand that trembled despite all his effort to hide it, and I felt something strange rise in me. Not joy, exactly. Relief, maybe. Or vindication heavy enough to feel like grief. Because here was the cost of all those years. I was finally winning the argument, and the people I had once needed to love me were the audience watching me do it. Before lunch, facilities deactivated Blake's badge. IT cut Page's email. By 1 o'clock, I was standing alone in the office my father had treated like a throne room for 20 years. The old brass nameplate still sat on the credenza. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, and set it face down in a drawer. He wanted me to leave with nothing. Instead, he left me the company, the truth, and a front row seat to what happens when arrogance signs where competence has already prepared the room. If I had stopped there, some people would have called it justice, the reveal, the closing, the transfer of power. The image of my father realizing too late who had been sitting across from him the whole time. But revenge stories do not satisfy because a villain loses a chair. They satisfy because the truth finally reaches every person who is forced to live underneath the lie. That was why my first act after closing was not a private celebration. It was a company-wide town hall. I walked onto the main production floor that afternoon with sawdust in the air, forklifts idle along the back wall, and every site supervisor, project manager, finisher, scheduler, and warehouse lead patched in by video from our other facilities. These were the people my father always referenced in speeches about family and tradition, while treating them like a backdrop in actual operations. Some had been with the company longer than Blake had been alive. Some had watched me grow up carrying samples through the workshop beside my grandfather. Some had probably wondered why I disappeared. All of them had spent the last few years living inside the uncertainty created by leadership that confused image with control. I stood at the front where my father used to make announcements and told them the truth in plain language. Everest Holdings had acquired Callahan Hearth and Timber. There would be no mass layoffs. Deferred equipment upgrades were being approved immediately. Vendor payment discipline would be stabilized. Warranty review would be handled honestly. Every facility would move to real production visibility, real job costing, real schedule control. We were going to protect the people who actually knew how to make things and stop subsidizing the people who only knew how to inherit them. Nobody clapped at first, and I respected that. Workers who have been fed polished nonsense for too long do not owe instant trust. Then one of the older mill supervisors in the back, a man who had known my grandfather, raised his hand and asked, "Are you actually going to fix the edgebander issue at Plant 2? Or is this another speech?" I looked right at him and said, "Purchase order is already drafted. Replacement approval went through at 11:30. The room changed after that. Not dramatically, not like a movie. It shifted the way rooms shift when people realize the person speaking has done the homework. Afterward, a few managers approached to ask careful questions about schedules, staffing, vendor terms. None asked whether I belonged there. That mattered more than they probably knew. Blake cornered me in the hallway outside the executive offices 30 minutes later. He came in hot, jaw tight, chest forward, still performing masculinity as if posture might reverse paperwork. He said I had done all this because I hated him, because I could never stand that Dad trusted him more, because I had always needed to prove something. I let him finish because men raised like Blake confuse being interrupted with being defeated. Then I said, "No. I did this because you kept getting rewarded for being less capable than the people cleaning up after you." That landed. He took a step closer and said Dad had spent years preparing him to lead. That's exactly the problem, I replied. He prepared you to be chosen, not to be good. He laughed then, bitter and ugly, and said I talked like somebody who had forgotten where she came from. No, I said. I'm the only one here who remembers what this place was supposed to be. The expense review notice went out to him before dinner. He did not know that yet, but I did. And I think some part of him sensed there was more pain coming because his confidence flickered at the edges. Paige tried a different approach. She came into my office later crying so hard she could barely keep mascara off her hands. She asked how I could humiliate my own family in front of employees, in front of outsiders, in front of people in town. She asked me what she was supposed to do now that her company cards were frozen and her accounts under review. Do, I said. For the first time in your life, probably work. She stared at me like I had slapped her. What Paige never understood is that vanity can be a kind of theft when it is funded by other people's labor. She had built an identity out of curated importance, private dinners, showroom trips, local magazine features, and a title inflated far beyond her contribution. She had mistaken access for talent because the family system had rewarded her for performing polish, while people on production floors carried the real weight. You cheered when Dad erased me at Thanksgiving, I told her. Don't ask me to protect your pride now. She asked whether I was enjoying this. That question almost made me laugh because it was so perfectly revealing. To people like Paige, consequences are cruelty whenever they finally arrive. No, I said. I'm correcting a balance that should have been corrected years ago. My father waited until evening. Of course he did. He always liked private confrontations more than public ones, once he no longer controlled the audience. He walked into my office without knocking and looked around like the furniture had betrayed him. Men like Thomas do not get smaller when they lose. They get denser, harder, as if all the grief of power leaving has nowhere to go except inward. He asked, was humiliating me the point? I almost answered with emotion. I almost told him how many nights I had replayed being dismissed in that very building, how many times I had watched him place my work in Blake's hands and call it continuity, how many years I had carried the insult of being asked to serve strategically while men with weaker minds were promised destiny. Instead, I gave him the answer he deserved. No, I said, the point was ending your ability to keep doing damage while calling it legacy. He scoffed and said companies were not built on feelings. Exactly, I answered. That's why you lost this one. You treated it like a stage for your feelings about power, your son, and your own name. He moved closer to the desk and told me I had disgraced the family. You disgraced the family, I said, the moment you decided blood mattered more than competence and image mattered more than truth. He stared at me for a long time after that, and for the first time in my life, I think he understood that I no longer needed anything from him. Not approval, not apology, not recognition. That realization hurt him more than the sale. You can punish a patriarch financially and still leave him a private myth. What destroys him is showing him his authority has become irrelevant to the child he trained to seek it. My mother came in not long after he left. Marianne Callahan had spent most of my life practicing a particular kind of gentleness that looks kind from a distance and disastrous up close. She was never the architect of the system, but she was the cushion beneath it, the person who saw harm clearly enough to feel bad and then chose quiet because confrontation made her tired. There are homes where silence is peace. In ours, silence was rent paid to male ego. She stood by the door and said, I always knew you were better at this than Blake. I almost smiled at the cruelty of how late the sentence arrived. Did you? I asked. Because from where I sat it looked a lot like you were fine letting him take what I built as long as dinner stayed comfortable. She cried then, not theatrically, not to manipulate me, but with the exhausted shame of someone who had spent too many years calling weakness tenderness. She said fighting my father never changed anything. She said she thought loving me quietly would count for something. Quiet love doesn't protect anyone from public harm, I told her. It just teaches the person being hurt that they're on their own. She nodded because there was nothing else to do with truth once it had finally entered the room. Before she left, she asked if this meant I was done with all of them forever. I thought about it longer than she expected. It means I'm done giving people access just because they share my blood, I said. What happens after that depends on whether any of you can live honestly for once. She wiped her face and left more slowly than she had entered. The forensic review findings started rolling in over the next 2 weeks. Unsupported executive expenses, vendor-side courtesy abuse, compensation misalignment, capital delay consequences, warranty exposure. Once those pieces began formalizing, the broader fallout started to spread through the business community around Asheville. The story that took hold was not the dramatic Thanksgiving version, though that floated too. The more devastating one was quieter and far more permanent. Thomas Callahan had mismanaged a respected legacy manufacturer, overplayed his leverage, and sold control to the daughter he had failed to recognize while she was the only one truly capable of saving it. Trade contacts called. Bankers whispered. Suppliers started revising how they spoke about our family in private rooms. Blake's review led to reimbursement demands. Paige's compensation package collapsed under scrutiny. Their first real encounter with consequences was not loud. It was administrative. Forms, letters, notices, account restrictions, repayment discussions. And that, maybe, was the cruelest part for them because people raised to think they are exceptional always expect their fall to be cinematic. In real life, status often dies under fluorescent lights. One afternoon, I watched from my office window as my father walked through the parking lot toward his car alone. No assistants trailing, no managers hovering, no employees angling for approval. Just an older man crossing asphalt with the posture of someone who still could not understand how completely the story had changed. He did not lose to a stranger. He lost to the daughter he taught everyone to underestimate. He lost to the fine print he never read. He lost to the difference between being selected by a father and being built by experience. And the hardest truth of all was that I did not have to break the law, break the company, or even break my voice to break them. I only had to stop letting their version of the family stand uncontested. The fallout lasted longer than the closing, and real consequences always do. My father became the kind of man people lowered their voices for in country clubs and trade luncheons. Not out of respect anymore, but out of curiosity, sharpened by pity. He had once loved being introduced as the steward of a regional legacy company. Now he was the cautionary tale attached to it. The executive who inherited strong bones and nearly sold them off under the illusion that family hierarchy could substitute for competence forever. In towns like ours, reputations do not disappear all at once. They leak. They lose shine. They start arriving in rooms a few minutes before the person does. Thomas Callahan still wore good suits, still straightened his back, still tried to sound authoritative when he spoke. But the market had done something no one in our family ever had. It had measured him without sentiment. Blake fared worse emotionally, because men raised as golden sons are uniquely fragile when life finally demands evidence. He had never developed the internal muscle required to survive being ordinary. At the company, people used to nod when he walked through because he was the owner's son. Outside that ecosystem, he discovered that job postings, lenders, landlords, and hiring committees do not care what your father promised you at 28. The reimbursement review stripped away his indignation in slow stages. First came anger, then denial, then the ugly defensive jokes, and finally the hollowing realization that the lifestyle he thought belonged to him had been subsidized by a story he had not earned. He took a role months later at a regional homebuilder in a mid-level operations support position, well below what he once assumed was his natural station. I heard through mutual contacts that he hated answering to younger managers. Good. Paige lost the easiest identity of all because hers had been almost entirely atmospheric. When the company budgets froze and her inflated title collapsed under scrutiny, she did not merely lose money. She lost the mirrors that had been telling her who she was. She had built a life around looking central, essential, visible. That kind of selfhood is fragile because it depends on other people continuing to fund the costume. Her house deposit vanished. Her social invitations thinned. Local magazines that used to photograph her at charity design previews found newer women to feature. Eventually, she moved into a smaller condo and took real contract branding work for businesses too practical to care about her last name. I am told she got better at the job once she no longer had a company underneath her to perform against. Pain sometimes does what comfort never bothers to attempt. It introduces people to themselves. My mother's consequence was quieter and, in some ways, sadder. She did not lose position the way the others did because her power had always been indirect, emotional, ambient, the kind that works by not intervening. But she lost the illusion that gentleness is automatically innocence. Over the months after the sale, she wrote me 3 letters. The first apologized without specificity, the way people do when they want forgiveness more than truth. The second contained more truth, but still leaned on her exhaustion as explanation. The third was the only one I kept. In it she wrote, "You were never difficult to love. You were difficult for this family to control." I read that sentence twice, then folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I did not cry. Not because it meant nothing, but because by then I had learned something women in stories like mine are rarely allowed to keep without apology. Closure does not have to look like reunion. Sometimes it looks like finally hearing the truth and still refusing to hand the speaker keys to your peace. On the business side, I did what I should have been allowed to do years before. I rebuilt the company on purpose. We replaced failing machinery, modernized scheduling, tightened job costing, reset vendor relationships, created design-build packages for boutique hospitality clients, and put actual performance dashboards in front of managers instead of intuitive storytelling and wishful ego. We brought in a plant systems consultant who had no emotional attachment to the old chaos and empowered supervisors who had spent years knowing what needed to change without having the political safety to say it. I restored the apprenticeship path my grandfather cared about and built a talent track for digital fabrication and finish specialization, because the future of craft is not nostalgia. It is excellence strong enough to survive technology by integrating it wisely. The most meaningful thing I created was the Walter Callahan Craft and Trade Scholarship in my grandfather's name. It funded trade school, technical certifications, woodworking apprenticeships, industrial design coursework, and supply chain training for employees' kids and for junior staff who wanted to grow. The day we announced it, one of our longest-serving finishers cried. He told me my grandfather would have liked that more than any of the headlines. He was right. That mattered more to me than humiliating my father ever could have. And that is where the heart of the story really lives, because despite everything, the most satisfying revenge was not watching my family lose the company. It was watching the company survive them. People often ask whether I forgave them. The answer is complicated enough to be real. I forgave enough to stop carrying them in my nervous system. I forgave enough to sleep. I forgave enough to build without needing their collapse every day as fuel. But I did not forgive in the way small-town morality loves to demand from daughters who were mistreated. I did not restore automatic access. I did not pretend apologies erase structures. I did not invite my father to advise me, my brother to reclaim space, my sister to drift back into image management, or my mother to shelter herself in proximity to my success after years of hiding from conflict. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Compassion and trust are not the same thing. Family and entitlement are certainly not the same thing. That may be the most important lesson in all of this, the one I hope actually helps people instead of merely entertaining them. Too many people are taught that loyalty means enduring whatever your family chooses to do to you, that being the capable one means absorbing more harm because you can survive it, that peace is whatever keeps the loudest person in the room from feeling challenged. None of that is peace. It is convenience dressed as virtue. Silence is not always kindness. Sometimes silence is collaboration with the person doing the damage. And boundaries are not cruelty, simply because the people who benefited from your lack of them suddenly feel cold. The people most offended by your standards are often the ones who profited from your self-doubt. I learned that too late for my childhood, and just in time for the rest of my life. About a year after the sale, I ran into my father at a regional hospitality manufacturing conference in Charlotte. He was standing alone near a coffee station, looking not ruined exactly but reduced to human scale, which for a man like him feels like ruin. He asked if the company was doing well. "Yes," I said. He nodded once and said, "Your grandfather would have been proud." I looked at him for a long moment because there it was, the closest thing to surrender I was ever likely to receive. Not an apology, not accountability in full, but a recognition stripped of his old ability to keep it from me. "He should have heard that from you when it mattered," I said. He didn't argue. He just stood there with a paper cup in his hand and the strange, empty dignity of someone finally forced to live without the myth that carried him for years. I left him there. Not vindictively, not dramatically. Just because there was nothing else to do. The family I thought I was fighting to belong to had been gone long before Thanksgiving. What remained after everything burned off was simpler and more useful than belonging. It was self-respect. It was discernment. It was the understanding that love without truth becomes manipulation, that legacy without merit becomes decay, and that a person can honor where they come from without surrendering to the people who misused it. I got the company back. I got the truth back. I got my grandfather's work back from the hands that would have sold it for applause, and spent the future before the wire even cleared. But what mattered most was this. I got myself back from the family story that had made me small in order to keep other people comfortable. So here is the lesson I would leave with anyone still trying to earn a place at tables that only value obedience. Do not confuse being needed with being loved. Do not confuse being tolerated with being respected. Do not confuse shared blood with shared character. And never let anyone convince you that protecting your dignity is betrayal, just because your dignity inconveniences the role they wrote for you. If your family only celebrates you when you stay useful, silent, and smaller than the people they already chose, then the most powerful thing you can do is build a life where their permission is irrelevant. Tell me honestly, if you were in my place, would you have forgiven them and let them back in, or would you have let them live with exactly what they built?